we will record the session. We will share the recording together with other useful resources with you all after the workshop. If you want, there is Spanish interpretation. My colleague Carlota will post interpretation instructions in the chat now. Please feel free to ask questions and put comments in the chat anytime. So let me begin with the quick framing of the learning series. As usual, the learning series is organized by the UNDP FACS community. The series seeks to be a space for you all to bring your concerns on in terms of implementation of the forthcoming regulation, and also to share practical examples to show and to share what is already available out there and what can be done to comply with the regulation. For this session, though, we will expand a little bit. So we are not only touching upon the EUDR, but we will also be talking about the corporate social due diligence directive, which complements the EUDR. So Carlota, if you don't mind sharing the agenda of today so that we can thank you. So today we will have GIZ providing a framing, as I mentioned, providing a brief recap of the EUDR. We will post in the chat soon links to previous sessions that we had that you can review, and they have been on beef, cross commodity, and on coffee. So if you are interested, you can learn more about the EUDR also through the past events. And so, as I mentioned, we will also touch upon the CSDDD. We will then hear a very interesting case study from the cocoa sector from Tony Chocolonely. This will be followed by a moderated exchange where we will welcome other experiences from all of you. And then we will wrap up and close the session. So now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to the first speaker, Simon Gmeiner, Policy Advisor from GIZ. Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greta, and apologies. We tried to test my camera for about 10 minutes before, and somehow it's not recognized by Zoom. So unfortunately, I will have to leave it off for this presentation. I don't see the slides yet on my screen. Okay, yeah, I think now they're coming up. If you could go one slide further, please. Yeah, so as Greta already mentioned, we of course in this webinar series, you have already discussed in detail the upcoming EU regulation on deforestation-free products. Today, I would like to introduce to you another legislative initiative of the European Union, which is called the EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. This is a legislative initiative which is currently being negotiated in the trilogue, so between the three main institutions of the EU, the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament. And we expect there to be a decision within this informal trilogue by the end of this year. The difference between the EUDR, the EU Regulation Deforestation-free Products, and this upcoming EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence is that the latter, which I'm presenting to you today, is a cross-sector and cross-thematic regulation, and it's EU-wide, whereas the EUDR regulation, of course, concerns specific sectors, mainly in agriculture and forestry, and is specific on the topic of deforestation and forest degradation. Whereas the CSDDD, how the acronym is, focuses on a broad range of topics and covers all sectors. So it mainly focuses on human rights, but also on environmental issues. Next slide, please. When we talk about this upcoming EU directive, we have to first focus on how it was all launched. There was a legislative proposal by the European Commission on the 23rd of February 2022. And in this legislative proposal, the EU Commission already defined its basic aspects of this upcoming directive, with the goal of defining binding human rights and environmental due diligence obligations for companies active on the EU market in all sectors. And the stress lies on all sectors. It's cross-sectoral. The scope which is being envisioned refers to companies with 500 or more employees and an annual turnover of at least 150 million euros on the EU market. So it actually focuses on companies which are based in the EU, but also foreign companies from third countries who do business with on the EU market. So even, let's say, for example, like a Chinese company like Huawei, who does more than 150 million of turnover on the EU market, would be concerned by this upcoming directive. Then the European Commission actually also defined 3 risk sectors, mainly agriculture, textile, and mining, where this threshold is even lower than that. So in these risk sectors, according to the Commission's proposal, also companies with 250 or more employees and at least 40 million annual turnover on the EU market would be concerned. However, within the negotiation process that is going on at the moment, for example, the EU Parliament rejects this definition of risk sectors and wants to apply lower thresholds for all companies from all sectors. So they don't want to have this distinction. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, maybe some of you will have heard of the German due diligence law. I'm just mentioning this here as an example, as it's currently the most far-reaching due diligence law in any of the EU member states. And here there are several differences which make us assume that the legislation on European level will be even more far-reaching than what has been proposed in Germany. It's actually already enforced in Germany since the beginning of this year. So we already have a first use case from several German companies who have to comply with this regulation. But the biggest differences are that within the legislative proposal by the European Commission, they don't distinguish between direct and indirect suppliers, but they put the focus on all business relationships within the supply chain. So just as an explanation, the German supply chain law, they distinguish between direct suppliers and indirect suppliers further down the supply chain, who had to, where the companies had to do a reduced type of due diligence, whereas the EU really focuses on the whole entire supply chain. The focus obviously is on upstream, so basically from the consumer up to the production, but also in some cases downstream. So activities such as marketing might be covered through this EU directive. Also, another difference is that the EU proposal foresees civil liability in case of non-compliance for companies, which is, for example, not included in the German law. In the German law, you can only have administrative fees in case you don't comply. But here, as far as we know at the moment, the European directive will also include civil liability for companies who don't respect the this law. Another important difference is that the EU proposal that we currently have, and also the positions from the European Council and the European Parliament, they actually include the topic of living wages as a protected human right. So it's mentioned in the annex, where the EU listed basically all the relevant human rights aspects that should be covered by the directive, and one of them is living wages. Basically they say that a violation of the prohibition of withholding an adequate living wage in accordance with Article 7 of the UN International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is prohibited, basically. So this is an important aspect because the German law only refers to local minimum wages, which in most cases don't cover all the necessary items that should be included in a living wage, and are sometimes insufficient. And the European Parliament actually wants to go even further than that by pushing for the inclusion of living income specifically for smallholder farmers, because of course farmers do not earn wages, they are self-employed, and thus they earn an income. So this is why the European Parliament pushes to include living income as well, in order not to leave these self-employed workers and smallholders behind. It will remain to be seen whether the European Parliament can actually succeed with this, because as far as we know, the member states see this topic a bit critically, and also so does the European Commission. So we will see what comes out of this negotiation process by the end of this year, most probably. Next slide, please. Here, I just put a little timeline for you in order to understand how, since when this process has been ongoing, and when could we see this directive enter into force. So as I stated before, there was this legislative proposal in 2022. Then the Council, which represents the member states, adopted its position on this legislative proposal at the end of last year. And the European Parliament adopted its position, which is referred to as a resolution, in a plenary vote on the 1st of June this year, so not very long ago. And as I mentioned, this position of the Parliament is a bit more ambitious, let's say, than the proposal by the Commission and the position of the Council. So the European Parliament will try to push for even higher standards when it comes to due diligence on human rights and the environment. Then I also mentioned that already, the trilogue, so-called, it's an informal negotiation between Commission, Council and European Parliament, started at the beginning of June as well, right after the European Parliament adopted its position. So since the 8th of June, there are negotiations between these three parties happening, which are basically served to reach a consensus on several different points where the positions of the three institutions diverge, and we expect there to be a decision within the trilogue before the end of this year. That might happen. Sorry, could you please mute yourself? I can hear someone in the background. Thank you. It might happen already in the end of October, or it might happen more towards the end of November, even in December. So it's really difficult to say. It's difficult. There are no fixed deadlines, but we expect there to be a result from this trilogue by the end of this year. And then when there is this decision, first the law has to be adopted through the European Parliament and the Council, so that will take time. And then there are transition periods already in the text of the proposal. So the European Commission, for example, calls for a 2-year transition period. Then the Council, they want to extend it to 3 years, and the European Parliament is somewhere in between. So we expect the directive to enter into force concretely for companies maybe in 2026 or 2027. So there's still some time, let's say, for companies to comply. to prepare their supply chains for these new obligations and to be ready for the entry into force. Next slide, please. This is just a small informative slide on different positions of member states concerning this corporate social due diligence directive. There is a relatively new like-minded group on EU level consisting of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, who have signed a joint declaration on living income and wages on the 1st of June this year. And the goal of this like-minded group of states is to push for the inclusion of living income and living wages in the upcoming CSDDD. And further, these 4 member states commit to mainstreaming the concept also in their development policies. So this is basically a relatively new like-minded constellation, which is still growing. Belgium and Luxembourg just joined this year. Germany and Netherlands already started it in 2021. And they are trying to push for that during the trilogue negotiations. But of course, there are other member states who don't agree with this point. So we will see what comes out of it. Next slide, please. Now I just want to briefly go into the differences between the CSDDD and the EUDR. I know that you've already looked at the EUDR in more detail. So here I just put together 2 relatively brief slides just to highlight the differences again. So whereas the CSDDD aims at basically protecting human rights and environmental standards in all EU supply chains or supply chains of companies that do business in the EU, the EUDR has very specific aims. It focuses on the theme of deforestation and forest degradation. It wants to minimize the EU's contribution to deforestation and forest degradation worldwide, and in turn also reduce the EU's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and global species extinction. So the 2 topics of climate and biodiversity are really at the center of this regulation. Then, of course, it is also specific to the relevant commodities who contribute to forest deforestation and forest degradation, such as palm oil, soy, beef and leather, cocoa, coffee, natural rubber, and wood. So it is not cross-sectoral like the CSDDD. Then it also has a specific scope, and it refers to all products that are placed on the EU market. So you have this trade perspective in that regulation. Placed on the EU market means imported or produced in the EU and then traded within the EU. And also it focuses on products that are exported from the EU market. There has to be this reciprocity, otherwise, the WTO would have objections against this regulation. So it refers to also to products that the EU exports into other countries. Next slide. Thank you. Then there's also a big difference when it comes to the due diligence itself, because in the EUDR, a failure to conduct the due diligence and reduce the relevant risks concerning deforestation and forest degradation can lead to an exclusion of trade possibilities. So basically, when products don't comply, when the companies importing those products did not manage to conduct their due diligence in the right way, or when they didn't manage to reduce the risks, the deforestation risks of their products, they are not able to enter the EU market. They are forbidden from entering the EU market. This is not the case for the CSDDD. There is no trade-related measures concerning the CSDDD. For CSDDD, it's basically an ongoing due diligence obligation that the companies have to fulfill, and the competent authorities of the member state have to control that the companies are doing that. But there are no, if a company fails to conduct its due diligence, there could be, they could have to pay a fee, or they could face a civil liability accusation and trial. but their products can still, of course, enter the EU market. And for the EUDR, there's a specific process, due diligence process, which consists of 4 steps. First of all, the companies have to collect data and information, including geolocalization data of their production sites. Then they have to conduct a risk assessment of the products, of the relevant products for the EUDR, so those agricultural commodities and the timber that I mentioned before. Then if this risk assessment shows none or only a negligible risk, then of their products, then they can just issue a due diligence statement for that product, and their product can enter the EU market normally without any problems. If the risk assessment shows a non-negligible risk, then they have to conduct a risk reduction. And if that risk reduction succeeds, then it's the same. They can issue a due diligence statement and the product can enter the EU market. If, however, the risk assessment shows a non-negligible risk and the risk reduction is not successful, meaning that the risk could not be reduced, it is still a non-negligible risk concerning deforestation and forest degradation, then those products are banned from the EU market. And this is basically the big difference between a CSDDD and EUDR. I think this was the last slide. So yeah, so I think we're at the end of my presentation. I'm happy to to answer any questions, and I'm going to take a look at the chat as well if you posted any questions. So please feel free to raise your questions now.
You can either jump in or put in the chat as you prefer, or let's see if there is anybody. While you can even think about your question, maybe we can go into the next session, and feel free still to put questions in the chat. So, for example, here there is one from Jorge. Timing for final approval, Simon. We can't hear you, Simon.
Yes, timing for final approval. I don't know if your question refers to the CSDDD or the EUDR, but I can just mention both here. So as you probably got from my presentation as well, the CSDDD is not yet decided. There are still negotiations going on, and there will be, we foresee that there will be a decision on the compromise text between the 3 European institutions by the end of this year. Then the directive still has to be passed through Parliament and the European Council, which could take maybe 1 or 2 months. So maybe early next year there could be a final approval of the legislative text. But then, as I said, there will be at least 2 or maybe even 3 years of transition period where the text is already out in the open, companies can look at it, and they can prepare for being compliant with it or for implementing it in their supply chains. So we expect it to enter into force concretely for companies in 2026 or 2027. For the EUDR, it's different. There has already been a decision by the European institutions on the legal text. It has been reached this year, not very long ago, I think 1 or 2 months ago. And the EUDR only has a relatively short implementation period of, I think, 1 year. So normally it will enter into force at the end of next year, so towards the end of 2024.
Thank you. From Caroline, have third countries' governments expressed concern about the CSDDD?
To my knowledge, concerning the CSDDD, there has been much less concerns and criticisms in comparison to the EUDR. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that some countries consider the EUDR as a barrier to trade, which is actually not. It has probably also something to do with the fact that there is no final text which has been approved. There's no final legislative text approved for the CSDDD, whereas for the EUDR, we already know what's in it. So I expect there to be maybe more criticisms from third countries, but so far I haven't received many of them actually. And for example, also just as another example, I mean, specifically from the cocoa sector in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, there have been voices calling for the inclusion of living income for smallholder farmers into the CSDDD, because it's being seen as a way to make up for the increased compliance costs on small producers and smallholders. So there are also actually voices from producer countries who are very much in favor of this directive and want to make it even stronger.
Thank you, Simon. And do you know if there is already some standards for the living wage, and will this apply to every actor in the supply chain?
So basically, on the topic of living wage, there's no ILO definition of the concept, but there's a definition by the Global Living Wage Coalition, which consists of the key stakeholders active on this in this living wage space, and which also includes several actors from the private sector. So companies themselves are actively engaged on that topic. As far as I know, the ILO is also currently working on an official international definition on living wage itself. It's something that, they didn't have a political mandate for a long time because of this tripartite structure between employers, unions, and governments. But now they have this political green light to go forward with the definition, and it will most certainly be based on the Global Living Wage Coalition's definition, which in turn is based on the so-called anchor methodology, which is considered to be the gold standard at the moment on methodologies to calculate these living wage benchmarks. So there are ways for companies to access that and to calculate those benchmarks.
Maybe one more question is related to, if you can elaborate on the fines and responsibilities and related matters, if you can elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, so concerning the CSDDD, there is no final legal text where I could base my my elaborations on. But for example, if you look at the German due diligence law defines clear fines which are connected to the annual turnover of the company. So it's maximum like a certain percentage of the annual turnover. And there are other measures such as the exclusion from public contracts that can be taken, and the competent authority can also, in case of non-compliance, can have access to the files of the company to check whether they actually conducted their due diligence. So they have certain rights of access, and they can conduct searches even if the company doesn't comply with providing this information. So unfortunately, concerning the CSDDD, I cannot give you any more exact informations because these things are still being negotiated at the moment. but I can tell you that it is very likely that the CSDDD proposal will include civil liability for companies. So victims of human rights violations or environmental violations could actually sue those companies on the basis of this upcoming directive.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for all the questions. We didn't have the time to go through in detail all of them, but please keep putting in the chat your questions. We will try to address them in writing, as well as on our FACS community. I've put in the chat the link to join the Deforestation-free group, where we will continue the discussions. Now, I would like to go on our case study. So while there are still few more months to get ready to comply with the EUDR, Tony Chocolonely is a great example of a company that is already prepared to meet the requirements established by this new regulation. So today we have Belinda Bork, Tony Chocolonely's foundation manager, with us. Belinda, can you tell us more?
Yes, gladly. I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. And yeah, as already also mentioned by Simon, I will introduce you a little bit to the cocoa sector in itself, a high-risk commodity or considered as such in many contexts, and therefore being a chocolate producing company for us, a very relevant discussion to have. As you can see, we have quite simplistic slides. We tend to go low on the text and big on the red colors. So what you can see here is a simplistic version of the cocoa supply chain. So what we're looking at, first of all, is the West African countries that do produce most of the world's cocoa. We're specifically looking here at Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that together produce over 60% of the world's global cocoa supplies. This is being produced by around 2.5 million smallholder farmers. Then what you see here in the middle as displayed as a factory, we have a handful of processors and manufacturers and big companies that stand here that produce, make and manufacture the chocolate and then sell the chocolate. Represented here at the end in the bars are all of us, or most of us, are the chocolate consumers. So that's the billions of people who actually do consume chocolate. And the way that we should look at the supply chain is a little bit like a tipped over hourglass. So what we have in the beginning is the millions of farmers that I just mentioned. Then in the middle, it gets very slim with very few companies that hold a lot of power. And then at the end, the billions of consumers. There is, in addition to this power imbalance, also an imbalance regarding the profits, because at the beginning of the supply chain, poverty is a very severe issue. And also the root cause for many of the labor issues and human rights abuses that do still happen in cocoa and that make it this high-risk product. More specifically, what we're talking about here, some of the numbers that you can see here I've already mentioned. So the 60% of production, the 2.5 million smallholder farmers, and then what you see on the other side of the slide here are really the issues from a human rights point of view that we are facing, which is the fact that there's about 1.56 million children working currently illegally in cocoa in only those two countries. That's about 1 in every 2 children. And 95% of these children are actually also doing dangerous works, that's spraying pesticides, using machetes and sharp tools, for example. On top of that, there's also around 30,000 victims of other illegal labor issues, such as forced labor. This issue also not only has a human rights aspect to it, but also an environmental side to it. So as I've already touched upon, so poverty really being the root cause here. And the monetary side is a very severe factor. So you can see here that cocoa farmers do earn way too little for the cocoa that they do produce, which then causes the illegal labor issues, but also the deforestation, which is why the EUDR, but equally CSDDD are very important. Overall, those are the 3 issues that we do aim to address in our cocoa supply chain. And we have gone about this by looking at a specific sourcing model, or our so-called sourcing principles that you can see here. Those are the purchasing practices that we consider in combination to be our approach to ultimately making the supply chain more equal, more ethical, and more sustainable. It starts off with the traceable cocoa beans, and I will go into detail a bit more because we actually look at 3 different forms of traceability here, which in different forms and ways all relate to the mentioned legislative files. On top of that, the moment that we do know where these beans come from, which is the foundation, we also do pay a higher price. As I just mentioned, the monetary side of things is very important. Farmers do need to be paid more. Simon also already touched upon the living income that is absolutely crucial for farmers and farming households to be able to achieve this. And therefore, there needs to be a higher price for cocoa, which we calculate as a so-called living income reference price. On top of that, we work directly with partner cooperatives. So that's represented here as strong farmers, which means that we have direct relationships into both countries and the farmer cooperatives there. We also do actually have teams on the ground. So that means that while I am based in Amsterdam, where Tony's Chocolonely started, we equally have a team in Ghana, and we also have a team in Côte d'Ivoire who liaise directly with the partner cooperatives. In addition, an important factor of poverty is also the time frame of this. The worst form of poverty is if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and the further you expand your planning horizon, the better things get. So what we're looking at in this context is actually sourcing and buying cocoa over a period that's longer than 1 season, so longer than 1 year, but rather we look at a minimum of 5-year contracts. This enables partner cooperatives to make long-term investments and really have a longer planning horizon. On top of that, of course, what we also need to look at is, of course, on the one hand, the quality of the cocoa, but on the other hand, also the productivity. That's also, again, where the deforestation factor, of course, comes in. As you've seen on the previous slide, cocoa is a huge factor in deforestation as a commodity. So what we're looking at is increasing productivity from the existing farms, so farmers do not need to encroach into forest areas. As I said, I will dive in a little bit more into this first aspect of traceable cocoa beans, because we actually distinguish in that context into 3 different forms of traceability. First of all, we are looking at operational traceability. So what we mean by that is really the foundation of saying we need to know where the beans come from, because then we can take responsibility. The moment that we know which farms the beans come from, we know where these farms are, we know who the farmers are who have produced them, and we know how much yield they're currently producing. We can really look into the entire supply chain, and we can support these farmers and work directly with them. That's why already back in 2012, we started making our supply chain traceable for cocoa mass. Shortly after, in 2016, cocoa butter then followed. And what you can see here at the bottom is how our so-called bean tracker system really works. So this is ultimately a software. The software runs on chain point technology. And what the software does, where there's multiple checks along the way of the supply chain, where different actors feed in data points that are ultimately a checks and balances system that obviously need to add up, because cocoa doesn't appear out of thin air. So if the previous data point should be adding up to the follow-up as well. So that's how you can see how we can trace the cocoa entirely from the farm and the farmer all the way to our production sites, and then also to the final products. The second form of traceability is the environmental traceability, which of course also in the context of EUDR plays a huge role. So what you see here is a bit of a simplification of different kinds of mapping exercises that play a huge role in this context. On the one hand, there's different forms of mapping. So there's, on the one hand, there's centroid mapping. So that is defining the central and middle point of a farm. But then there's also a thing called polygon mapping, where you really have, as you can also see here, the outline of farms. So this is what we are aiming for, and what we've now achieved for all of the farms in our supply chain is a fully polygon mapped supply chain. That means we know exactly where these farms are and what their exact outline is. And then we compare these to the governmental forest maps to really make sure that there's no farmers and farms that encroach on these territories. So that's the environmental traceability that is equally fed into the bean tracker system, so into our operational system. So we overlap there the knowledge of the beans with the GPS mapping data that we do have available. Also interesting, and especially in the context of also CSDDD and the general human rights side of things, is the side of social traceability. In the context of social traceability, we use a system that is called the CLMRS. So that's the Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System. What that means is that all households in the cocoa communities where our cocoa cooperatives or our partner cocoa cooperatives are active are being visited on a regular basis by so-called community facilitators. These household visits mean that there's a conversation happening, and if child labor is recognized, then this will be picked up to find different kinds of solutions to remediate these cases of child labor. Because as you've seen in previous slides, 1 and 2 children means that child labor is very prevalent in West Africa in cocoa, and something needs to be done about this issue, so solutions need to be found. This means that there's different levels of solutions. On the one hand, that can be an individual focused solution. So that can be a child that maybe just lives too far away from school and therefore requires a bike to cycle to school. That would, for example, be an individual solution. On the other hand, there might be a community solution. For example, if there's a village and there's a realization that a lot of children are not going to school, there might be a reason here to build a primary school or a secondary school for these children, and therefore that would then be a community solution. On top of that, it's also about actually following up on these cases and making sure that the solutions were actually fruitful. So what we do conduct is we conduct follow-up visits in this context, and we do make sure that, for example, at the exact same point in time in the following season, these households are visited again. So, for example, if the pressure because of cocoa being a seasonal crop, because of the high cocoa season at that point, if the pressure is again higher, we still want to make sure that these children are also not working at that point. So you see, this is a circular approach, and ultimately, a bit the underlying factor that we really do use to make sure that we look at human rights abuses, but also the environmental threats that simply do exist in cocoa supply chains from a holistic point of view. This is my presentation, so I will stop sharing my screen, but I am willing to take any kind of questions.
Thank you, Belinda. Yes, I would like to ask you, what are the challenges that Tony foresees in complying with the regulation?
Yeah, that is a really nice question. So I would say, of course, so what we do see is with all of the traceability monitoring that we are doing, we need to make sure that there's a high data quality level. So that is definitely something where also a lot of squaring needs to happen. That on the one hand, of course, is a company quality measure in that context. But of course, also the forest maps that are provided by the government need to be up to date and to a high standard. And on top of that, we do see this, on the one hand, it is a challenge, but ultimately we hope to see this as an opportunity to really go into data sharing, because a lot of the cooperatives that we work with directly, they also do work with other companies. So what we would be hoping for in that context is that there's data sharing for example, of these GPS mapped farms happening across companies, so everyone has access and insight into exactly the same data to guarantee that there isn't any deforestation happening.
Thank you. And in terms of opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, overall, the opportunity, of course, aside from really working on limiting deforestation and doing something about it and really remediating it, we do see that, this is a chance, like legislation overall, because it means companies need to fulfill certain sustainability requirements. And basically, this is an incentive to step up the traceability game. We were told back in 2012 that it isn't possible. Clearly, it is possible, and now it is required of many. A similar discussion is often going on regarding the living income and paying a higher price. We also see that that is possible. So we really do see this as an opportunity to set a higher standard and really raise the bar on the general approach to human rights in such a high-risk sector.
Thank you. And one last question from my side. What suggestion would you give to your peers here today on how Tony Chocolonely example can be replicated? your call to action to the other practitioners here?
Yeah, first of all, in the context of cocoa, we actually have an initiative running, which is called Tony's Open Chain. So in that context, we have decided that ultimately what we use a lot as a tagline in that context is we look at to collaborate on cocoa and then ultimately compete on chocolate, because that's how we believe the world should actually be structured. So that ultimately means that we have given our supply chain blueprint and this initiative to the open space. So that means anyone can join the initiative who is sourcing cocoa and who has interest in this. So that also means, of course, upcoming compliance and legislation that makes the initiative very interesting. So in the cocoa context, we invite everyone to join Tony's Open Chain. And in general, the 5 sourcing principles that I presented are very transferable principles. So in that context, the traceability, the paying the right price, the price that does enable a living income or paying a living wage. On top of that, the direct relationships, so the real understanding on the ground, the longer planning horizons, and equally the agroforestry and agricultural measures. All of those can also be applied easily to other crops, and yeah, are therefore very transferable.
Thank you very much, Belinda. Now let me share some questions that practitioners colleagues have put in the chat. So Suzanne is asking, in terms of deforestation, you mentioned you look at overlapping with protected areas with government maps. EUDR goes further though. How are you assessing supply chain deforestation? Which tools, what has worked, what not? How have you done ground truthing to understand root causes?
Yeah, really nice question. So first of all, aside from a mapping exercise, we also go through an annual remapping exercise. So we're making sure that the data actually stays up to date or on an annual basis. On top of that, based on the fact that we do have the size of the farms, so we know how big they are, and we also see the yield coming into our bean tracker system, we have a quite automatic checks and balances ultimately, because if we see that a quite small farm is producing quite a lot, then that already says maybe there's like, where's that cocoa coming from? So there's a direct follow-up happening via the cooperative with these farmers. So there's that check already in our system. And then of course, yeah, basically stepping up that game and kind of making sure that our data warehouse will adhere to what is upcoming in the EUDR context is now the next step and the prep for the next season.
And related to this, what happens if you do identify deforestation given EUDR requirements?
Yeah, really nice question. What we've done is we've done a land use analysis actually of the past 2 decades to see whether or not we were running any risks. We've done that in the past with Diligence. No illegal or no deforestation was found in that context. But of course, we do have a protocol in place in case this should be happening. So the first conversation that needs to be had is what actually happens with the farmer, because it is not about disengaging, but the same as the child labor approach as well. It is about finding a solution and about remediation in that context. So again, it is about working together with the cooperative and finding individual solutions for these respective farmers that luckily until now we have not found.
Good. So Daisy is asking, what is the role of government in your traceability system?
Yeah, very nice question. Definitely also a good one. So the way that we implement the system is really cooperative led, which means that the data ownership lies with the partner cooperatives, and they of course operate in the respective countries. That means they have this data and they can provide any kind of data that will maybe also in the future need to be provided to the different governments that can be passed on. So there is this direct relationship, which is not an outsider or a company that is based elsewhere, but it really lies with the business and the partner cooperatives on the ground who have the full data ownership of the different traceability systems.
Thank you. And Dot is asking if you heard about a jurisdictional approach related to the data sharing you mentioned. I don't know, Dot, if you want to elaborate a bit more on your questions, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Greta. Hi, Belinda. It's a very insightful information coming from Tony's. Regarding my question about jurisdictional approach, I'm just curious whether you heard that terms before, or Tony's already participate in that kind of approach. That approach allows all multi-stakeholders to working together in certain areas where they source their perhaps from your side is your beans of cacao. You can share data information from your sourcing areas.
Yeah, again, really good question. So the way that this is definitely approached, aside from adhering to any kind of GDPR regulations, of course, so we do make sure, and equally do the cooperatives, that yeah, only the data is shared that is allowed to be shared, and yeah, ultimately that also a lot of things are kept separate in the way that, for example, pharma codes would not be connected to names, and therefore there's no data leakages of any private data that is happening in any of the systems. So all of these systems are proofed against regulations and data sharing standards.
Good. And Daisy Cardenas, would you like to? She's interested to learn more about this traceability system. Would you like to elaborate on your question, Daisy?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Good morning, Belinda. I am talking in Spanish. Bueno, nosotros en Ecuador tenemos una experiencia interesante con el tema de trazabilidad. Está actualmente a nivel de pilotos, pero nos gustaría conocer, porque nosotros lo hemos hecho a nivel de gobierno, por eso es que mi pregunta iba como un poco orientada al rol que hacían los gobiernos. Sin embargo, me gustaría conocer como desde la parte privada, que en este caso tú representas, cómo poder escalar este trabajo que ustedes realizan, manteniendo un precio diferenciado, ¿no? Porque el esfuerzo que hace el productor para mantener sistemas de trazabilidad es importante. Gracias, Belinda. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, really good question as well. So basically, how that will go, or what we also again see as an opportunity in that context, is the fact that national traceability systems are of course needed, and that is ultimately the direction that really needs to go in. So what we absolutely see is that in our case, Ghana and also the Ivorian government, of course, are already working on this, and these are great incentives to really improve also the legal framework and the governance around such a high-risk product. So what we see as an opportunity from a company perspective is that we can share learnings, we can show what we have done on a way smaller scale, of course, than the national production that is currently happening. We're currently at about 0.5% of the West African cocoa. We're looking to become about 5% in the next 10 years. And of course, that kind of means that we have an approach that we can share, and we're willing to look into opportunities to also support in whichever way possible and work together with the government to make these international traceability systems.
Thank you, Belinda. Another question, Simon is asking that many cocoa farmers, they even don't dare to let their children help in the farms after school in their spare time, because they are afraid of being accused of child labor, and so this could lead to problems related to the succession on the farm, as kids cannot be properly trained in farming. How Tony is responding to this?
Yeah, definitely. Elderly cocoa farmers is a reality that we are facing. What we see that cooperatives do work with quite a lot now, and where we also see, yeah, this is kind of a two-sided solution nearly. We have a lot of organized labor gangs or working groups in the different cooperatives, and they provide specialized tasks and are usually very young people. So early 20s, for example. So these young people are being reintroduced into cocoa, but of course also only working the moment that they are old enough, and they do the task that also maybe the elderly cocoa farmers cannot fulfill anymore at that time. So we are fulfilling these specialized labor needs, like for example, high branch pruning is something that can really be difficult and is therefore being done by labor gangs. And that also means that there is a younger generation that is interacting with the crop, that works actively in this context, maybe not in the beginning as a farmer, but as part of a labor gang, but therefore stays in the community and actually stays engaged with the crop as well. So that is one way of how the cooperatives currently work on this.
Thank you, Belinda. Do you do any purchasing through traders, both local and international? And I would also like to add another question into this. What are the incentives provided to various role players to participate in your bean tracker?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually at this point have various options regarding the different processes. So Tony's Open Chain also tries to keep a bit of flexibility there. So if there are different cocoa product brands, whether that's chocolate or other products at this point, we actually have a variety of 11 companies at that point who use different kind of processes. And yeah, we do work directly with all of these processes. So all of them are also included in the bean tracker system. And what we do see is it is also a great sustainability exercise for them. So for example, we started back in the days, actually the first traceability system was set up together with Barry Callebaut, definitely one of the big players in the cocoa context. And what we've seen with them is that they've given us the trust and opportunity to have a completely segregated and separate flow at their factory. That means that we had a separate tank and we managed to set up an entirely separate supply chain there. So to really guarantee the traceability level that we wanted at the time. So we also see that these kind of collaborations and working also, and in this context, yeah, that is, for example, also Baronie and Semois, so also definitely Ivorian-based processes. Natra is another one that is already part of the enabling processing side of Tony's Open Chain. We see that these processors and traders also like to learn alongside with us and be challenged in a way to see how can we step up the sustainability game and what options are there when you ultimately see that there are players who are trying to push for the sustainability that is needed to guarantee human rights in cocoa.
Thank you. And apologies if I'm not pronouncing it well, Mtoko Zisi, would you like to complement to this question that you just asked in terms of incentives? You mentioned that it is not possible to collaborate with statistical agencies. Would you like to jump in and elaborate more on what you just put in the chat?
Good morning. No, I just wanted to find out whether are there any incentives you provide to some of these role players like companies or farmers, because at times as you undertake these surveys, you find the response rate, it becomes low. So what incentives do you provide to those people to incentivize them to participate in your tracker studies? Beyond that, it will be valuable if this data that you're collecting, you complement or you collaborate with statistical agencies, as they from time to time they do undertake some surveys which become your administrative data sets, which could be data that would be useful to various policymakers and other role players, in terms of how do we improve the issue of value chains going forward, which
Absolutely.
could be replicated in other value chains. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, both of those, also a valuable contribution for sure. So first of all, we do pay a so-called cooperative fee on top of the living income reference price. So we want this price for the higher price for cocoa to go directly to the cocoa farmers, because that really enables the living income for the cocoa households as well. What we do pay on top of that is a currently fixed fee of $50 per metric ton, which goes directly to the cooperative and which enables them to run their business and administration, because you're absolutely right. Of course, we are asking for more, and we are asking them to implement additional things, to conduct additional visits, and really, basically walk further and take further steps. So that is done by a financial additional compensation of a so-called cooperative fee. On the second part, we're always very open to share any kind of data. We also report very publicly on everything that we do. So I am more than welcome. Please find me. I'm also happy to put my email address in the chat afterwards. If you feel like there are opportunities to share our insights and share our data, I'm more than happy to provide insights of our analysis and pass them on to policymakers or anyone who finds use for them.
Great, thank you very much, Belinda. James is asking, the relationship appears to be direct between the Tonys Chocolonely and individual farmers. What, if any, role does the cooperative have in implementation of the traceability?
Yeah, so this is on the one hand a very practical one. So we are currently working with 11 cooperatives, and that amounts to around 15,000 farmers. We do not have a direct relationship with every single farmer, but the cooperatives are really the ones who are ultimately really the organizations and the businesses that the farmers are members of. So this direct relationship is absolutely done via the cooperatives, who are our direct business partners, and who, amongst other things, for example, all of the directors also and managers come to Amsterdam once a year. So we really uphold the relationship directly with cooperative management. So with the higher level management there, that is 11 partners, which is very manageable compared to 15,000 farmers who ultimately come in the step as farmer members in that context. That's how our line of report and work is set up in that context.
Irebe is asking how is Tony Chocolonely traceability system feeding into or sharing lessons with ongoing initiatives for traceability in their sourcing countries like Ghana?
Yes, so we have different kinds of initiatives going on. We work, for example, very closely at the moment with IDH, and we're also fair trade certified. So we are always looking in different kinds of contexts where we can share our data insights and take this further. On top of that, we have a very active team, for example, also in Ghana. So we have a Ghanaian country manager who's very active in making sure that we do share our data with the relevant agencies. Equally in Cote d'Ivoire, where we even have an even bigger team. So we are making sure that also our teams on the ground, and especially the country managers there, are equipped and have the oversight to connect to the right agencies.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Belinda. And please, if you have any further questions, feel free to put in the chat. Now I will leave the floor to my colleague, Christina Arter. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you, Belinda. I mean, I think just looking at all the questions that we've had and continue to come in, you've obviously given a really clear presentation, great examples that people have been able to engage with, and has got kind of thinking going and already started a discussion. So thank you, Belinda, for sharing that. I mean, it is a very particular example that Tony's has, but as you say, already joining hands with other companies and making your model open source. I think that's really exciting. I just want to say that a lot of the questions there, Belinda, please feel free to keep answering them in the chat as they're coming there, but we will also post them in the FACS community, because we do want that to be where we can continue having some of these discussions. So if any of you have any thoughts you'd like to share on some of those questions that were raised, feel free to do it that. So my colleagues will put that in the chat. But I wanted to have a little opportunity now to also start reflecting a bit on what we've heard, and to hear more from you, not so much questions to Belinda about Tony's, but just to give you all a space to think about what have you heard, how does that resonate with where you sit and the work that you're doing, and just having a look at the, we had over 100 people with us at one point today, representing governments, representing companies, producer organizations. We have quite a wide range of participants here today. So just to hear from you on how that resonated. The other point I just wanted to start to sort of, kick us off with, the objective of this session, as Greta said at the beginning, was we have spoken a lot in this learning series already on deforestation and the EU regulations coming up, because that is happening, that is very immediate. It's coming upon us very, very quickly. So we've shared a lot of information about that that is available on the community links that have been shared before. And one of the key points that many of you brought up when we were forming the learning series was around traceability. Traceability is going to be a key issue. It is something that we need. But as we heard from the Tony's example today, having a good traceability system isn't only going to help you comply with deforestation, but also with other regulations that may well be coming, for example, the CSDDD, and also, of course, helping you either as a government or as a company or as a supporting organization to be looking at other issues. So traceability isn't just related to deforestation monitoring, it will help and support all of the other work you're doing. So that was one of the main objectives of today's sessions. I wanted to maybe call on colleague from our team, the UNDP team in Ghana, Irabi. You've already posed quite a few really interesting questions in the chat, but working with the cocoa sector in Ghana and working with the government in Ghana, have you got any thoughts and reflections on what you've heard from the Tony's example, and maybe just share some thoughts about how you see the Ghana cocoa sector thinking about the EUDR and the CSDDD that's coming. Irabi, you still with us?
Yeah, hello, Christina, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly, thanks.
All right, okay, hello to everyone, and great to join and share thoughts on it. I'm happy to hear of the Tony's example and the points that they raised in the comments that followed on from that presentation. I think they shared a lot of very interesting points that I'm sure many people would either relate to or most of maybe pick up some lessons from. On the Ghana example, just to say, I mean, I'm happy to hear the example shared by Belinda. It's also good to know that there are a lot of ongoing, if you like, self-financed, I say, in quotes, initiatives that are private or privately led initiatives that are ongoing within countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast to help meet the expected obligations under the new EU directive. I think Ghana is no different when it comes to that. Recently, I think just about a month ago, there was one workshop organized and also sponsored by the German government together in collaboration with the Ghana Cocoa Board, basically to respond to and to help the Ghana government be able to still be in the line to still sell cocoa within the EU when this directive kicks in. So it's quite clear that the countries like Ghana are taking this quite seriously. My understanding is that already they have this there is this cocoa, what we call the cocoa management system, which is something that was started in 2019 by the Ghana government to sort of help address some of these issues that they themselves anticipated would be coming on stream within the sector going forward. And I think one of the things they are doing now to enhance traceability as part of this cocoa management system is the traceability, what they call the cocoa traceability system, which is embedded within this cocoa management system. The whole idea of this is to make sure that they're able to basically trace where each plot that is being able to produce cocoa beans, and also to be able to ensure that they are both deforestation free and also are addressing other issues that are related to things like child labor, etc. And currently, I think they have been able to, from the last information that we had at UNDP, I think they have been able to map out over 1 million farms within Ghana as at now, as at I think the last 2 months, over 1 million farms within Ghana. This is also been able to capture data of up to about 700,000 farmers, cocoa farmers within Ghana. So I think that they are taking the steps that are needed. And I think it will be, that is why I think that I posed that question. I think it will be good that the example of Tony's and others that are doing similar things within Ghana really find a way to also make sure that they are part of the conversation, and that there are lessons that they are learning from their own private initiatives are also being brought to bear within this national system, so that it is able to learn from them and better work to also, you know, help enhance the sector within Ghana. So these are the thoughts that I wanted to just briefly share with them. And I think it is good. I mean, it'll be good, Belinda, to also maybe get in touch with your team here in Ghana. I think the EU and GIZ especially are really collaborating a lot more with the Ghana Cocoa Board on this, and it will be good to see how they can also, you know, share some of these lessons readily with these teams that are working on this particular project for the government of Ghana. Thank you, and over.
Thank you, Arabian. And I think you've kind of helped illustrate how can we take these really great examples, and as a couple of people have put in the chat as well, where some companies, and Tony's is a leading example really within cocoa, are investing a lot and have over 10 years been investing in these systems needed to know where the cocoa comes from, be able to track it back, but it is still a small percentage. So how can we scale these up? And then where governments are on their side looking for implementing these systems now in order to ensure that they can still access the EU markets, are we going to have interoperability between the data sets and harmonization between existing ways of monitoring that maybe different companies and even sort of commodities and value chains have with what maybe a government is setting up? And on that, maybe in a future learning series, we can have colleagues from the GIZ team present a little bit on their DIASCA project, which is looking at exactly that. How do we ensure consistency and interoperability of these data sets that we're getting? But sticking on the issue of how we work with governments, because UNDP's primary partners are governments, and we are talking here about how we take some of these examples to scale. Daisy, we had Daisy and her colleagues present in one of our earlier series a really great example where, in partnership with Lavazza, and we've had Mario on the call with us today as well, they also implemented a traceability system there. But Daisy, I know you asked a question, and I think that's a very valid one. How can we take some of the examples that we heard from Tony's, and then through government, like yourselves, be able to implement systems like that can help not only look at deforestation, but also human rights? So Daisy, I don't know if you had any thoughts you'd like to share on what you heard and how you can see that being useful for the Ecuador government that's working on a lot of issues, of course, not just deforestation, but you also have your premium and sustainable approach. So what are your reflections on what you've heard? And obviously, please speak in Spanish, and interpretation button is on the bottom for everybody that would like that. Adelante, Daisy.
Okay, Cristina, thank you so much for this opportunity. Yes, I am talking in Spanish. Bueno, en el gobierno del Ecuador lo que se ha trabajado es básicamente un sistema de trazabilidad que lo tienen los productores. Este sistema de trazabilidad ha sido a través de un proyecto que está siendo apoyado por el Programa de Naciones Unidas acá en el Ecuador, a través de un programa grande que es el Programa Integral Amazónico de Conservación de Bosques y Producción Sostenible. Y lo que pretende este sistema de trazabilidad es básicamente evidenciar una producción sostenible, pero también que esté libre de deforestación. Entonces, lo que tenemos aquí son básicamente mapas parecidos a los que hace Tony's, del perímetro de la finca, pero nosotros también pedimos una zonificación entre lo que es el área de bosque y el área de producción de chocolate o perdón, de cacao o de café. Entonces, eso ingresa al Ministerio de Ambiente acá en el Ecuador, y una vez que ingresa a través de una serie de requisitos, se evidencia, ¿no? Con todo el mapeo oficial que tenemos en el país, para saber si es que desde un año base, que en el caso del Ecuador nos hemos trazado como año base el año 2014, en adelante ha habido o no deforestación. Obviamente, si es que no hay deforestación, nosotros entregamos un distintivo a este tipo de producción. Y posteriormente, en conjunto con el Ministerio de Agricultura, se genera también una certificación. Actualmente tenemos ya 2 pilotos, y tal vez a Mario le va a gustar mucho este tema, que los pilotos que nosotros enviamos de café hacia Lavazza, hacia Italia, ya han sido certificados y reconocidos por el gobierno ecuatoriano. Entonces, ese es un logro muy importante. Pero este sistema de trazabilidad que nosotros tenemos es desde desde el productor hasta el centro de acopio. Entonces, es muy importante porque el producto puede ser escaneado a través de un código QR, y se puede evidenciar la finca y el bosque donde se encuentra, donde está ubicado dentro de esta finca. Entonces, para nosotros este piloto es muy importante y se tiene bastante avanzado ya en esto. Nosotros queremos escalarlo, lo hemos hecho ya en 2 regiones de acá del Ecuador, en la parte costanera del Ecuador y también en la parte de la Amazonía, que es como la más prioritaria para la conservación de bosques acá en el país a nivel del estado ecuatoriano. Entonces, nosotros estamos viendo una oportunidad importante con empresas como Tony's o como Lavazza para poder avanzar o escalar este tipo de experiencias, porque obviamente el que manda en este trabajo es el mercado, ¿no? Un precio diferenciado es muy atractivo para los productores para que puedan alcanzar este tipo de distinciones dentro de la producción y también de certificaciones. Entonces, tenemos algo de diferencia con el tema del due diligence y también del UEDR, perdón, del EUDR, pero sin embargo sigue siendo una posición del Ecuador para poder conservar los bosques, ¿no? Y está siendo impulsado por el gobierno ecuatoriano con el apoyo de la empresa privada. Muchas gracias, Cristina. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Daisy. And obviously the traceability system you have now in place, as you explained, will support the deforestation monitoring of that. But hopefully as well for the human rights element, do you think that the system you have in place will also help monitor some of the other aspects that Belinda spoke about? More related to human rights, like child labor or living income. So Daisy, do you think your system would also, or are they good examples you can take from Tony's that maybe you can look to include in your current system?
Sí, básicamente me llamó mucho la atención el sistema. Ellos trabajan con 3 sistemas, ¿no? El sistema de trazabilidad del producto como tal, que era en masa y en butter, en manteca. También estaba el sistema de trazabilidad ambiental y el sistema de trazabilidad para el tema de pobreza y de salarios dignos. Entonces, son 3 sistemas que me parecen muy interesantes. Nosotros estaríamos dentro de nuestras competencias como Ministerio de Ambiente trabajando específicamente el ambiental, que es el de libre deforestación. Sin embargo, estamos haciendo esfuerzos en el país para poder integrar estos temas ya para responder al sistema de debida diligencia de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Entonces, sí, definitivamente, con Belinda tendríamos que hablar mucho respecto a los otros 2 sistemas que maneja Tony's y poder complementar el trabajo que nosotros realizamos en el país. Muchas gracias, Cristina.
Gracias, Daisy. Thank you, Daisy. So some good reflections there from colleagues who are working more, well, representing governments or working with governments to add to the private sector example we heard from Tony's. I'm just going to give you all a minute to either raise your hand if you'd like to jump in and offer a reflection, a question, or a thought on what you've heard, sharing maybe your experience. But also just a minute to put in the chat, again, any thoughts you have. Just to say, again, questions that you have for Belinda, we will take and put on our community website, and we hope that Belinda and her colleagues will be able to answer them there. But just for now, what would you like to share with the group in the last couple of minutes that we have? So I'll just give you a minute to put some thoughts in the chat and maybe put your hand up and we can invite you to come and share something in the group. Thank you. I'll just give you a minute. So who would like to share a thought? Anybody on the call would like to reflect on what we've heard today? Did it resonate with you? Is it giving you inspiration for something that you'd like to copy, something you'd like to try and adapt for your context? I can't see any hands. Who's there that would like to share some thoughts with the group?
Hi, Christina, it's Justin. Can you hear me?
Yes, Justin, go ahead.
Hi, I mean, I found this really useful. It's the first of these sessions I've been on, and the business I'm involved in is to do with biomass and forestry, and so therefore deforestation, degradation, etc. is a big issue. Traceability is a big issue. So great to hear the example from Belinda and to understand how you're tracing your bean tracing is fantastic to see that happening. And I think from in an EUDR perspective, you know, what we're interested in is learning how other sectors who are affected by EUDR are tackling that and able to meet that, because it's quite a challenge, I think, and it's, you know, our perception so far is perhaps more of a challenge for some of the other sectors than perhaps the way that we operate. We already have GPS tracking and polygons for all of our sourcing areas, but good to see and to learn a bit more about the chocolate supply chain. So thank you for that, incredibly useful.
Great, and thank you for joining us, Justin. If you'd like to share in the chat any links to the work that you're doing. I know that we've had questions in the past about polygon mapping and issues related to that. So if there's anything you'd like to share as a resource or just to signpost people to the work that you're doing in your organization, feel free to do that in the chat. Anybody else would like to share a reflection? Or have we had an hour and a half? You've been very patient, you sat through this, a lot to think about. Please do carry on putting things in the chat. Otherwise, I'll pass over to Greta and say thank you very much to iArabi and Daisy for sharing their thoughts and their perspectives from their side. Greta, over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and I would like to thank you all the speakers in the first place, as well as all of you for having contributed to this session, for all your great questions and interventions. So let me put in the chat a link to a brief survey that we kindly ask you to complete. It doesn't take long, but your feedback is really valuable for us in order to design future sessions, and we are planning to host other sections in the coming months. So your feedback, ideas would be extremely useful for us. And don't forget also to join our FACS community, as well as check the Deforestation-free group, where we usually upload additional resources. There is also a forum where you can interact with each other, you can put questions, and so on. So we will send you the recording of the session together with some other useful links. And I think if there is anything else, Alexandra, that you would like to share, or Christina, then if not, we can close this session for today. Thank you all again for your participation.